You know that moment when you're staring at a dense article or maybe a stack of notes,
Mhm.
and it feels less like learning and more like, I don't know, getting lost in a fog?
Oh, definitely.
All the information is right there, supposedly, but connecting the dots, really grasping it, it can be a real challenge. That feeling of disconnection, almost like information overload, but without real comprehension, that's such a common hurdle for learners.
Absolutely. It happens to everyone.
So today we're taking a deep dive into a source that offers a really unique, I have to say, almost idiosyncratic perspective on why students might face this kind of challenge. It introduces a concept it calls cognitive blindness in students.
Mhm.
Our mission here is to step inside this specific framework, try to unpack its core ideas, wrestle with some of its very unique terminology, and understand the mechanisms it proposes are behind this cognitive blindness, how the source says it shows up,
Yeah.
and what might address it.
Right. It's a very particular model.
Exactly. This isn't just about defining terms. It's really about exploring a distinct way of looking at learning difficulties presented in this material.
Let's get into it.
Okay, let's jump right in. The source really focuses on this idea of cognitive blindness. How does it actually define this central problem? What are its key characteristics according to this specific text?
Well, the source defines cognitive blindness in students as a kind of a multifaceted challenge. It's not just one single thing.
Okay,
It encompasses specific deficiencies, a struggle with understanding the material itself, difficulty with transferring that knowledge, applying it to new situations, and ultimately a lack of engagement or interest in the learning process.
so it's those three things hitting at once:
Yeah.
understanding, transfer, and engagement.
That's right. So if a student is experiencing this, according to the source, they're not just failing to grasp facts, they're struggling to use what they know, and crucially, they're losing motivation along the way. The source also sometimes calls it knowledge blindness, uses them interchangeably.
Knowledge blindness. Okay, that makes sense on the surface: understanding, transfer, engagement. But then the source links this blindness to some very specific, and I have to say, quite unique sounding requirements for knowledge. Tell us about what it calls matrix and spectrum.
Yeah, this is where it starts building its own kind of theoretical foundation.
Hmm.
It explicitly states that cognitive blindness happens, and I'm quoting here, when there is lack of matrix and spectrum in knowledge transfer and brain page module development.
Okay, wow. Matrix and spectrum.
And it uses this metaphorical framing. It positions the spectrum book as the mother book of knowledge transfer and the matrix book as the father book of brain page development.
Mother and father books, so not literal books.
No, not literal books you read. They're
Yeah,
presented more as like fundamental components or maybe tests related to how knowledge is absorbed and organized in the mind within this system.
gotcha. And you mentioned brain page module development there. That's another term that just pops right up. What exactly is a brain page in this context? How are we supposed to picture this?
This is probably the most central and maybe the most abstract concept in the whole source. Brain page modulation is described as the actual achievement of skill, knowledge, and experience.
The achievement of it.
Yeah. Think of brain page modules as like the individual units or structures of learned information and capability that a student builds up. The source sees this as a modular process, really essential for both school performance and then later on for workplace processing.
Okay, units of learning.
Right. And having a smart brain page, as it calls it, is linked directly to learning quality and the capacity for high-level problem solving.
Okay, so brain page modules are the learned units. Building them is brain page modulation.
Mm-hmm.
But what about those other terms that came up in that definition? Things like nucleus of knowledge page, coid of brain page solution, main functional Zide and Zide page. That got really dense really fast.
It does, yeah. The source uses a kind of nested structure there. The nucleus of knowledge page is described as the coid of brain page solution. COID, yeah. Which itself is identified as the main functional Zide. And this main functional Zide apparently contains the fundamental pattern of Zide page. Now look, these terms are pretty abstractly defined within the source itself, but the core idea they seem to be pointing towards is the essential functional core or pattern inside a brain page module that makes it actually useful and, solvable.
So the active ingredient, almost.
Something like that. The source is trying to break down the fundamental components of what makes a knowledge unit successful and functional in its view.
Zide. That word keeps coming up. The source even talks about a Zide factor.
Yeah.
There's this crucial element, this Zide factor.
Or the Zide factor. It's described as being related to a student's ability to control competing behavior and attention, basically helping select the correct mental pathways for processing information.
So focus and selection.
Kind of. It's linked to the student's cognitive ability to do brain page processing and perform what it calls book-to-brain motor knowledge transfer. Now here's where it gets really unique. The source calls Zaid the fundamental particle unit object of knowledge transfer, and it actually draws an analogy to a photon.
A photon, like the particle of light, a fundamental particle of knowledge transfer.
Exactly. That's the comparison it makes.
Why? Why that comparison? What aspect of knowledge transfer is it trying to capture by calling it a particle like a photon?
That's a great question. The source doesn't elaborate deeply on why the photon analogy specifically, but the implication seems to be that Zaid is the most basic, maybe indivisible unit required for knowledge to successfully transfer or be processed within this system. It's like the elemental currency of learning.
The currency, okay.
And the source adds another really fascinating twist here. It says, mistake is a form of Zaid factor that helps fix problems.
Wait, a mistake is a form of this factor.
Yes. And then it contrasts this by saying cognitive blindness does not detect mistakes. So mistakes, seen through this particular lens, aren't just errors. They are active participants in the learning process, mediated by this Zaid factor. And the absence of recognizing them is presented as a sign of cognitive blindness.
Wow, okay. Mistakes as part of the fundamental learning particle. That's different. All right, let's move deeper into the brain's proposed workings within this framework. The source talks about an optimal learning stream and something called the architecture of school learnography. How does the brain supposedly handle all this knowledge processing?
So the source lays out a specific set of mechanisms. It lists 7 particular learning circuits that students can apparently apply: cognitive, limbic, motor, mirror, compass, formatting, and Zaid.
Zaid again, so it's a particle in a circuit?
Seems like it, yeah. Zaid is listed as both a factor particle and one of these circuits. Then it introduces something called cyclozaid.
Cyclozaid.
Yeah, cyclozaid. Specifically located in the thalamus, apparently, and described as the brain's central learning machine or working machine.
The learning machine in the thalamus.
That's what it says. This cyclozaid is described as crucial for effective learning, for forming strong memories, retaining information, and also for generating new ideas and innovation. And the way this machine works, according to the source, involves the cycling of knowledge blocks and loop formation.
So the cyclozaid is like the engine in the thalamus, running on these Zaid particles, processing the brain page modules using those 7 circuits. It gives some very specific metrics, too, doesn't it? Like targets for brain page modules, daily processing limit.
It does, yeah. It offers numbers that are meant to provide some scale within its model. For test preparation, it suggests a target of 2020 brain page modules, whatever that means precisely.
2020, okay.
It posits the idea of processing 4 subjects daily as some kind of optimal rhythm. There's even the concept of a one-day, one-book school system, suggesting really focused learning.
One day, one book.
And it contrasts this huge potential, like 20,000 possible brain page modules built over 15 years of schooling, with the seemingly much smaller number of 5,000 modules it says are needed to be intelligent.
Only 5,000 to be intelligent out of a potential 20,000?
That's the figure it gives. These numbers seem intended to quantify the scale and density of these brain page structures that are supposedly being built and processed.
And tying this all together is this concept of learnography. What does the source mean by that term?
Learnography is described as brain science applied to moderating task, time, and brain page development, specifically for school performance.
Okay, so the practical application.
Pretty much. It's presented as the practical application of this whole understanding of brain mechanisms to the actual process of education.
Yeah.
And it says both school learnography, formal learning, and home learnography learning outside school are important within this framework.
And the teacher's role is also framed in a pretty unique way here as the blackboard performer.
Yes, exactly. The source really emphasizes the teacher's active role in creating what it calls the optimal learning stream.
Side stream.
That comes later, yes. The teacher uses speech, writing, visual imaging all together to generate a live and dynamic blackboard effect. LADBE.
LADBE. Okay.
And this effect is what supposedly leads to the optimal learning brain stream known as Zaid stream.
Ah, okay. LADBE creates the Zaid stream.
That seems to be the idea. And interestingly, it also mentions that students who are pre-trained or maybe more advanced are referred to as becoming small teachers, which implies they sort of embody or can facilitate the same dynamic transfer process.
Interesting. It also touches on something called hotline connection between human brains, contrasting the active learning brain with, well, technology.
Right. The source draws this contrast between the functional smart brain page, which is the active learning brain engaged in all this complex processing we've been talking about, and the smartphone.
Oh,
Yeah, which it somewhat dismissively calls a talking brain designed on robot side.
robot side. What's that?
It doesn't fully define robot side, but the implication seems to be that it's a more passive or maybe artificial form of connection or processing compared to the active human functional smart brain page. It highlights that a student whose brain is exhausted from constant talking or passive reception, maybe like too much smartphone use, potentially struggles to learn these facts properly.
So the active brain page is different from, or maybe even hindered by, this robot side.
That seems to be the argument, yeah, that the active learning state is distinct.
And what about the idea of a learning voice, acting as the brain's memory card, or this motor mapping of human articulation being advanced for learnography?
These add even more layers to this very intricate model. The learning voice seems to be the internal, maybe auditory representation of knowledge.
Like inner speech.
Possibly. Functioning like a memory card that enables the mental visualization and organization, the imaging and mapping of these brain page modules, and advancing the motor mapping of human articulation for learnography. Well, that suggests that the physical act of speaking and forming words is seen as deeply connected to and maybe even helps facilitate this internal learning and knowledge organization process.
So the way we talk shapes how we build these brain pages.
That seems to be part of the idea presented here.
Okay. So if this is the problem, cognitive blindness, and these are all the proposed mechanisms, ZAID, brain page, cyclozide, learnography, how does the source suggest actually addressing this cognitive blindness?
Well, the source suggests that something called a brain page school would be key.
A brain page school.
Yeah, and this type of school would encourage procedural learning, which it defines specifically as learning by doing question answer.
Learning by doing Q&A.
Right. The idea here is that this active engagement allows students to directly learn from the mistakes of brain page, which, as we discussed, the source views as a helpful form of Zide factor. It's all about building and correcting those brain page modules through active use and engagement.
Makes sense within its own logic. So how does the source wrap this all up? How does it summarize the core challenge of understanding and addressing cognitive blindness based on all these interconnected ideas?
It basically concludes by reiterating that tackling cognitive blindness really requires addressing the roots it identifies, the quality and clarity of the knowledge transfer itself, deficiencies in the actual development of these brain page modules, particularly linked back to that lack of spectrum and matrix, and of course the student's disengagement or lack of perceived relevance.
So fix the transfer, build the brain pages correctly using spectrum and matrix, and keep the student engaged.
That's the essence. The overarching goal within this very specific framework is to transform the school system itself to proactively prevent these problems from arising in the first place. And it also directly links the grading system, which it presents as the evaluation of learning quality, straight back to the Zide factor of learning stream.
So grades are measuring the Zide factor.
Apparently so. It suggests the assessment itself is or should be measuring this fundamental unit and stream of knowledge processing as defined by the source.
Wow. Okay, we've definitely taken a deep dive into a framework that is, well, certainly unique, exploring concepts like cognitive blindness, the fundamental Zide factor, these structures it calls brain page modules, the foundational elements of spectrum and matrix, the learning machine known as cyclozide in the thalamus, and this idea of an optimal learning stream or Zide stream.
It's a lot. This source offers a very specific, sometimes quite abstract, model for thinking about why students might struggle. It points to these detailed internal mechanisms and structures, suggesting that difficulties stem not just from external factors, but from issues in the fundamental processes of knowledge formation and transfer, governed by elements like Zide and built into brain page structures guided by spectrum and matrix.
Yeah, it presents a complex challenge, really defined by its own unique vocabulary and concepts, but it also offers specific areas for, understanding and potential intervention, from the idea of those 7 learning circuits to focusing on procedural learning. recognizing the role of mistakes as Zide factors, and evaluating learning quality through the lens of that Zide factor.
Absolutely. Understanding this particular framework from the source provides a very distinct perspective. It encourages you, the listener, to see learning difficulties through the lens of these proposed underlying brain page mechanisms, these Zide particles, and this whole architecture of learnography, rather than maybe just looking at the observable symptoms.
Right. So thinking about everything we've just covered, this idea of brain page structures, the cycloside learning machine, Zaid as the fundamental particle of knowledge, those metaphorical mother and father books of spectrum and matrix, even robot Zaid. What does this highly specific, almost Baroque brain page theory of learning mechanisms provoke you to consider differently about the actual, maybe physical process of learning? Or perhaps why it sometimes feels like your brain just isn't connecting the dots, even when you think you have all the pieces?